by the artist Arturo de Monica. And what you might not know about this bull, he's been created to represent the aggressiveness of capitalism. The bull's head is lowered, his nostrils are flared, and he has wickedly large, sharp horns ready to roar. And it's an angry, he intended to be an angry, dangerous beast. And the muscular twist in his body from side to side shows that, and his tails are used as a lash. But what you might not know about this bull that's on Wall Street is that whether people like it or not depends on how the market's going. When the market is going really well, this becomes an item that tourists come to, and they rub the bull's horns and its nose to give them good luck. And tourists do it all the time. But recently, with the downfall of the economy, they've had to sanction it off and have a guard watch it 24 hours because people have vandalized it. Now, we live in a post-Enlightenment age. No one thinks there's a spirit inside that bull, I'm quite sure, or really believes that that bull is an idol and that it's a living thing. They know it's a piece of iron, and yet they ascribe to it certain animosity and certain worship. I told you before that the Greeks and the Romans were far more advanced than we are philosophically, so you've got to wonder, why did they worship stones? And why did they worship these golden stones and these bronze stones? Because we know they're not alive. Well, like in all cultures, they had classes. And there was a vast underclass that was very superstitious, although educated, that really believed these statues could come to life at night and do things. But the higher educated class, Aristotle and Plato, those guys, the Epicureans and the Gnostics, and Aristotle and Plato were Gnostics. They did not believe the idols came to life, but they sacrificed to them anyway because they believed in the ideas behind the idols. They believed that the idols represented something that would help them in this life. And the Christians agreed. They believed in the ideas behind the idols would do them great damage. Aphrodite, who had a temple of prostitutes, who masturbation was a sacrament in her temple. Jupiter, who was known to be a murderer of children. These gods, and it makes me smirk and laugh, but it's tragic how New Age people bring these gods back, but they divorce themselves from all the bad stories about them, just bring the good stories back about them. When Christians were persecuted in the Great Persecution for 300 years, the Caesars did not persecute them because they didn't believe in the idols. They persecuted them, and they say this, there's a whole bunch of letters from Epiphany the Younger to Epiphany the Elder. And they were two Caesars, one was training the other. But because they were stubborn. They were stubborn. They said, we know it's not true, but just worship them anyway. We just want to have loyalty within our city. And as a curiosity that during the Great Reformation, again, when there was 400 years of persecution of Protestants, it was for the same reasons. We have writings from Henry and from the popes, is that they're stubborn. We don't care what they believe. And then the most recent one, Karl Barth and Bonhoeffer in Nazi Germany, when they were told to sign their oath of loyalty, their fellow clergy told them, it doesn't matter if you believe it or not, just go along with it. Because that's the most recent history we know what just going along with it means. Because the ideas behind the idols are the dangerous things. When I worked for Head Start, I worked with Vietnamese refugees, and I have to say most of the refugees I worked with were Christians, very strong Christians. But there was one family with a little boy who had epilepsy, and he had a golden altar inside his house to Buddha. At this time, I was taking comparative religions at San Diego State. There's a tradition in Buddhism that when a child is sick, you dip oranges into hot oil and you whip the child with the coins to get them better. So when I saw the bruises, I had to report to the Child Protective Services. And Child Protective Services had some rules that if it's a religion, they're going to watch the family carefully, but they're not necessarily going to take the child out. But they are going to monitor them. So after the little boys, the parents were told this hurts them, don't do it anymore, it was remarkable how quickly they stopped doing it. But when I brought it up in my class and compared to religion, because he was talking about how Buddhism is so superior to Christianity, his response was, without those cultural norms that went around with Buddhist teaching, I'm sure if Buddha were alive today, he would not teach that, but at one time he did. That's not good enough for me, I'm sorry. Jesus didn't teach those kind of things when he came. So when I see idols coming in our culture today, even something like this, I pause. And I remind the church, like Paul does, remember he goes to the church first, that we don't worship idols. If you want to go to a monument, the 9/11 monument, or other monuments, stay and ponder about the things that happened, but don't worship idols. We worship the one true living God. So let's look at the text today and see how the Apostle Paul deals with the idols that are within his midst. Just to let you know, I'm not going through the whole text. I read it together because it's one sermon, but we can divide it up into 3 parts. Some of you think, oh my gosh, it's going to be preaching for a good day. But we're going to divide it up into 3 parts. I didn't want to take the sermon out of context. So while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see the city was full of idols. He was greatly sharpened. I talked about that last week. He started to think. He started to strategize. What is my job here? He didn't willy-nilly go out and start smashing idols, which I'm sorry to say that's what some of our Protestant brothers and sisters did during the Reformations. They went to Catholic churches and smashed the idols and smashed the church windows. Okay, he didn't do that. He spent some time in prayer, and he thought about it. And he went first, not to the non-believers, but to the household of faith. And he reasoned. He reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Greeks, as well as the marketplace, day by day with those who happened to be there. And a group of Epicureans and Stoic philosophers began to dispute with him. Some asked, what is this babbler trying to say? And others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. And they said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Now the Epicureans were the intellectual elite, and they did not believe in resurrection. They did believe in the idols, not only because the idols taught a type of hedonism, a type that you could enjoy life to its fullest, but also the idols helped the economy. The buck was the bottom line with these guys. So I just have a little poster here of what came from these 2 guys. The Stoics, if we say someone is Stoic, we tend to say that Stoics are, that they don't show any emotion. And that's not exactly what Stoics were. They showed emotion. But what Stoics said is you should not base your beliefs on emotions, but on the intellect. So that's how we get the idea of Stoicism. And they believed in human responsibility, that people attributed too much to the gods, that we should take some responsibility. Now, there's some wisdom in their philosophy, or wouldn't have failed. I wouldn't have succeeded for all these years, but he still succeeds. And reason was what you tried to acquire. They believed that God was God, that he was in everything. And he was a fiery spirit. And each of us had a divine spark of God within us. That's kind of a downplay. We believe God was created in, we were created in God's image. But they said each of us had that divine spark. And they believed that everything happened was the will of God. So when something happened, you weren't supposed to be hysterical. You were supposed to say, but they wouldn't say God, they'd say fate, that it was fate. Have you ever heard that? It's just fate, just accept it. And you should accept it without resentment. They also believed that the world was in a cycle. Remember the Lion King is the circle of life? Goes back to the Stoics. And in this cycle, the world was inevitably would rise up from the dust, then it would destroy itself, then it would rise up again. We're seeing this discussion now in certain evolutionary circles. But what's scary about the philosophy is that there's no divine hand that's compassionate. Now, from the Stoicism, we have a sense of humanism, and I'm going to use a word that's been politically used, so I'm asking you to be prejudiced the way you hear it. What I would call secular humanism. Now, I don't agree with a lot of things that have gone on politically in the name of that term, but let me define what that term means. Humanism arose out of the church, a lot of people would say. Now, Plato and Aristotle, who were Stoics, said that we should be good to people because they were part of the city. And if you wanted to be happy, you had to make sure your neighbor was happy. That was civic humanism. And then Christianity rose, and St. Francis of Assisi and other great saints who saw the damage of war advocated, no, we should treat people well because they're created in God's image. That is Christian humanism. I had an interview with someone over the radio who said there's no such thing as Christian humanism, and I told him, you don't know church history very well. For years, John Calvin and Martin Luther advocated for children to be educated, regardless of their religion, so they could read their Bible. They advocated public schools. St. Clair started the first hospitals. Florence Nightingale built upon her. They advocated for the common good. Why? Because people were created in God's image. That is Christian humanism. Now, I know that Christians disagree as to what laws will help the poor or hinder the poor. That's why I get nervous when people stand up politically. But I've got to say, a program that helps the poor is not non-Christian. That's Christian humanism. Secular humanism would go for the Stoics because it's civil humanism. It says we should be good to people because they help the economy. And you hear that argument in certain circles. And while you might have that attitude politically, as a Christian, you should be good to people because God is good and He made them. So when someone comes to this door and asks for food and they're drunk, I give them food, not money, knowing that they may be drunk tomorrow and the next day and the next day. When I worked at St. Vincent de Paul as a shelter, they'd have some debates where people would say, are you really helping? And I remember one priest standing up and saying, you get to the point when you know that someone's so addicted to alcoholism, you say, I'm going to put a pillow under their head and let them die in peace, or I'm going to let them die on the streets. But you understand you're not going to rehabilitate them. Why do you show that compassion? Because God is good. Not simply because they're good for the economy. The Epicureans were the other group, and the Epicureans believed everything happened by chance, and death was the relief of all pain, but it was the end of everything. And God was so remote that you could not know Him, and He did not care about humanity. So the Stoics said God was in everything. The Epicureans said God was really in nothing. He was out there, but He wasn't someone that you could know. And pleasure was the chief end of man. So you had to do everything for pleasure's sake. But like the Stoics, they said, if you want to know your optimum pleasure, you need to make sure everybody else in the city is taken care of too. So both of them had this civic pride, but both of them hated the idea of heaven and depending on the God because they felt people may use that as an excuse. And from our good friends, the Epicureans, comes hedonism, which is living life for the seven pleasures. I just said the seven pleasures, the seven great sins. I didn't mean to say that. Although it's true, for the simple pleasures of life. 90, just do it. If we're consenting adults, who cares what goes on in our bedroom? My soul wasn't hurt by this. Just take care of yourself, and I'd say more of that bull that the bull of Wall Street. Just little lies were told, people thought. I know a minister that got involved in the housing bubble as a real estate agent. And he told me later in tears, we were just telling little lies. We don't think they have any consequences. Almost every Great Depression we've had has been a dishonesty. So out of this comes hedonism. So by Paul, some people would see Paul in their books where saying Paul was narrow-minded by taking away these people's culture. As a Christian, I'm saying Paul saw the dangers of these philosophies. And these philosophies saw the danger of the Apostle Paul. So they take him up to a mountain, and they have him defend his faith. Then they took him and brought him to the meeting place of Areopagus, where they said to him, may we know what this new teaching is that you're presenting? For you're bringing strange ideas to our ears, and we want to know what they mean. And all the Athenians and foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about the latest ideas. I forgot the Greek word they used. What is he babbling about? Was bird picker. Sparrows got a bird picker. What you call idiots in those days were sparrows who would go into the gutter and pick out food among the human waste. So they're saying it's BS, what Paul's saying. But they bring it to Areopagus, so they didn't think it was too much BS. Because in Areopagus was a mountain that was named after Plato, or Mars, because there was a great battle among the gods. And among the gods, Mars had to defend himself. And the only people allowed on this mountain were the Stoics and the Epicureans. It's where you try people for capital offense, although it doesn't seem like they're trying him for a crime, but they're asking him to defend his faith. And the second part where it says all the Athens and the Bible is in parentheses, because Luke is speaking in a sarcastic tone. And you see it in the Greek when someone does everything in what's called a subjunctive tense, in an unreal tense. He's saying, yeah, they thought they were talking about it. He's kind of making a joke about them. But Paul takes this opportunity to present the gospel. Even though he's been insulted publicly, he, as a Roman citizen, has been taken again with no trial and held captive by the city council. But Paul first tries to talk to them by telling them that he thinks they're somewhat intelligent. Then Paul stood up in the meeting of Areopagus and said, Men of Athens, I see you are very religious. For I walked around and looked carefully at the objects of worship, and I even found an altar with an inscription to an unknown God. Now you worship something that is unknown. I'm going to proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, heaven and earth, does not live in temples built by man. And he is not served by the hands of humans as if he needed anything, because he himself gives life to all men. So I just talked about the term secular humanist because it has a philosophical basis. What bothered me during the 80s and 90s was when people would shout that at someone else. You secular humanist. I've had shouting at me, in fact. But when they did that, you disengaged them. Paul doesn't start by disengaging them. A Muslim woman appeared at my door the other day because she was lost and was scared because she was used to being with her husband all the time. And she didn't know what the addresses were. I invited her to my house. We got a cup of tea. We looked up our map for us what she needed. She saw that I was a Christian by my cross, but I didn't talk about her paganism, not once. That wasn't my job. And I told her, when she asked me what I did, I said I was a woman preacher. She said, we have some women preachers. I said, yeah, I know that you do. And we talked about that, but I didn't worry about arguing the faith to her because I knew my faith was going to come across anyway. Paul begins by saying, I see you're very religious. I respect that in you. And frankly, the stuff I respect about people who are moral and have laws around their morality and obey those. So he begins by that. He says, I see that you have an altar to an unknown God. And the story behind that altar to the unknown God is written, I've got to find the Christian's name, by Origen and Tertullian. Origen and Tertullian knew the story of the first century Christians, that at one time a plague entered the city about 300 years before this, and it killed people. No matter who you sacrificed to, people were dying. And so a stranger brought in a bunch of sheep, and he says, let the sheep wander, and wherever they lay down, you sacrifice to the idol that's closest to where they wander. But when the sheep lie down by a place where there's no altar, altars to unknown gods. This shows the desperateness of people when they run out of their options. Everybody was dying, they just wanted the pain to stop. And when Paul says, I'm going to proclaim to you, not that you can worship God through this, but I'm going to proclaim to you something you innately know. You know there's a God, but you don't have all these. You don't have all these statues. You know that you can't do things by yourself. You have that plague in your background. Let me tell you about the one true God, who is Jesus Christ. The God who can be known. The God who can be known. And the God who will be personal. Now this God is going to offend both the Gnostics and the Epicureans, because in their head we're trying to get away from that. We want people to take responsibility. We want them to be civilly minded, to make your own heaven here on earth. And you're going to tell me about this Jesus. And all those ideas sound good. I want people to be civically minded. I want them to take responsibility. Where it goes wrong is that there's a place and there's a time when you can't take responsibility because tragedy enters your life. After I buried Jeanette Polito, a man came up to me and he said, our minister didn't show up, would you be willing to do another funeral? And it was just for about $20. But I noticed the family was all upset, so I said, this is a divine appointment. And I went up to do the funeral, and it was a young mother who was taken in a car accident. And while the family was religious at one time, they were angry at God. And they hadn't been back to church since December, and it wasn't that the minister didn't show up, the family patriarch had kind of refused to call anymore because he was mad. And as I heard their stories after the funeral and talked to them, I told the husband, who was in grief, I said, I understand your anger, but I want you to consider something. You would not be angry if there was no God. If you would just say, it's just life, and that's sad. You're angry because you think God failed you. And he said, yeah, I do. I said, well, you keep that conversation going with God. He'll answer you. There's a sense Paul starts with, you know there's a God, but this God is not a God who's abstract and a way off. And I know there are clergy that preach that now, that if we talk anything about personal God, and somehow we're failing the gospel. At Isabel Bishop's sermon, at Isabel Bishop's funeral, we sang, I come to the garden, and there was a minister who told her that wasn't a Christian song because it was too much about being God. And I so disagree with that. It should not stay just being God, but it should always start with you and God. And the people I mentioned, Francis of Assisi, St. Clare of Assisi, Florence Nightingale, I can go on, Susan B. Anthony, George Washington Carver, Martin Luther King. Those great social justice people started with me and God. And then something grew out of that. Before Christianity is anything else, it's personal. It's not academic or ethereal, and it's not merely a work ethic. It's a proclamation of the personal God who demands of us to make a personal choice and to encounter Him. When Paul says that God doesn't live in the hands of any human, of the building of any human man, he is making a nod to Solomon's prayer. And Solomon prayed that God, even though I know you don't dwell in this house when we built his temple, may your presence visit us. And that's what I pray before every service. And so, the points of my sermon, the things I want you to contemplate from here, is God is knowable. You can know God. It's not arrogant to say that I can know God. Many statements of faith start with God is beyond our knowing and understanding. And the statement of faith that the session and me came up when I came with was that our duty was to know God, to be known by Him, and to make Him known. God is knowable. That's what Paul said. He said, now what you worship is something unknown I'm going to proclaim to you. And God is omnipresent. And I'm going to read King Solomon's prayer. 1 Kings 8:27-28. Can God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I built? You give attention to your servant's prayer and to his plea of mercy. Oh God, hear my prayer, hear my cry, and the prayer that your servant is praying for your presence in this place this day. And God doesn't necessarily need us, and that's the part of the sacrifices. When these people sacrificed sheep, they were sacrificing about half of their income. And the poorer you were, the more painful it was to make that sacrifice. But God wants us. It's a love relationship. And it's based not on a usury relationship. And just to quote what the Apostle Paul said, he is not served by human man as if he needed anything. Because he himself gives all life and breath and everything else. We're going to sing a song called Now I Belong to Jesus. I wish I had a picture of his often because he died only in 1996. But he didn't really like his picture taken. He was one of those hymn writers who wrote the melody first, and then he wrote the words to follow the melody. And he preferred this song above all others because it speaks of the mortals, believers, spirit being united with the divine Christ, and yet each retaining our own distinct essence. So we're each different, but we all belong to Jesus. And he said it's a glorious relationship that begins with the believer the moment of genuine response to the call of Christ, that one day will last for all eternity. He said the high point of his life is when he went into a Down syndrome school and a little girl sang the song. Because it proved to him that the reality is that this faith can be grasped by the most simple person to the most, and it baffles the most intellectual person. We all come to it. And after the girl sang that song, he stood up and he gave a small sermon to the crowd. He said, God is for us. That is good. God is with us. That is better. God is in us. Ah, that is the best. As we sing that song, may we understand that it's our call to Jesus Christ that draws us to the Lord. Brothers and sisters, the grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of God lasts forever. Thanks be to God.